Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, grasshoppers, as we look at yesterday's upset of Magnus Carlsen. The day before this game, Magnus Carlsen made a statement as he was leaving the arena for the day in the Superbet Zagreb, Croatia Rapid and Blitz event. Part of the Grand Chess Tour. He made a statement that he would be treating Gukesh just as he would any of the other weaker grandmasters that he's expected to beat. Let us observe his treatment of this game in action. So, for the most part, as it turns out, basically after the moves c4, e5, personally everyone knows that I prefer either knight f6 or c5. In this particular case, I also recommend to students e6 followed by d5, returning to the normal queen's gamut decline if you're a little bit less experienced, although I'm not a structure-based trainer. I do believe that you should try to make the game easier for yourself and more difficult for your opponent. However, Gukesh chooses e5, and the most surprising move on move number 3 to me is the fact that Magnus Carlsen did not play the obviously best move, knight to d5. This move, interestingly enough, is one that should be considered all the time and embarrassing this bishop. This is not a pin. However, instead, Magnus Carlsen played the rather lackluster knight f3, the nonchalant knight f3, allowing this rather easy equalizing move, bishop takes c3. Now, honestly, if you are fighting for a win in this position, you should be capturing with your b pawn, but he decides to treat it like a Rossolimo Sicilian reversed. And of course, he also wants to make the decisions easier for himself and more difficult for his opponent. Gukesh answers with the top of the line engine move d6. And Magnus Carlsen misses his opportunity in this case. Let's see if we can bring up our timer. That's what we're missing. We're missing the opportunity to play c5. Interestingly enough, c5 is obviously a move that needs to be considered. And in this particular instance, Magnus Carlsen continues rather in a lackluster fashion with the other equalizing move, e4. Not that white needs to equalize. However, Gukesh responds with a rather unusual and interesting move. Not one of the top-of-the-line engine moves, but knight d7 with the simple plan after bishop d3 to play c5. Now, of course, in the Lichess database, this is a novelty. Whether that's a novelty in the chess-based universe remains to be seen. Magnus, of course, does want to keep his bishop pair, and he does want to build up an advantage. Gukesh continues developing rather rapidly, hitting the e4 pawn. White continues to maintain his control of the center with queen e2. Gukesh does everything he can to cement his knight by trying to prevent b4. However, I think b4 should still be a consideration since we have another pawn behind that one, and the bishop will automatically go to b2. This is just a very natural play. The knight will have to return, the bishop will go to b2, a pawn will go to c5, and we'll remove the defender of e5. Basically, it's defended twice by the knight and the pawn on d6, but Gukesh chooses instead, Magnus Carlsen chooses instead to play in Rossolimo, reverse Rossolimo fashion with knight to d2, aka knight to d7. Now an extremely strange decision. An extremely strange decision on Gukesh's part. The natural move to secure his knight on c5 is a4 when any when any movement of the b pawn will be met by a takes b3. And since the rook on a1 is undefended, This rook on a1 is undefended. The rook on a8 would certainly love to capture it. So therefore, he doesn't do that, and instead plays the move. Knight f1. Whoops, sorry, I apologize. Black plays the very unusual looking move, g6, with the idea of playing knight to h5. And this is a very slow plan on Gukesh's part. Honestly, I believe that he should be following the classical principles of improving all of his pieces, controlling the center, and being aware of king safety in one direction or the other. Magnus Carlsen nips this in the bud with the idea of playing knight to g3. So Gukesh abandons this plan, returns to attacking c4. White takes the natural development of the bishop, pinning. h6, of course, kicking the bishop before worrying about anything. And after bishop to h4, g5, bishop to g3, you might refer to that bishop as a caged bishop. The bishop on g3 is certainly a caged bishop. It's not permanently caged. As on the next move, Magnus Carlsen plays the move f3. Now, once again, Gukesh could have cemented his knight with a4, but insists on allowing Magnus to play the move that may ultimately decide the game. After reinforcing his center, Gukesh continues on the same vein of improving his knight from f6, where it had no prospects other than guarding the d5 square. And Carlsen immediately moves his queen away from any hits on it by knight to f4. As knight to f4 arrives, whoop, I take that back. Knight h5, Magnus Carlsen plays knight to e3, knight f4, queen d2. In my mind's eye, those moves were transposed. I actually expected him to play it the opposite way, so I can only apologize. And in this particular instance, Gukesh immediately strikes out, declaring his intentions with b5. Now this position is totally equal. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this position for black. It is at this moment in time that Magnus decides to go for the cheesy check on f6. And Gukesh has very little choice, as the values of the knights on the third rank are worth 3, of course. The values of a knight outposted on the fourth rank, such as the knight on c5, is worth a bishop. But the knight on the fifth rank is worth a little bit more than a bishop, which is often why they are captured by bishops. And many of you know the famous game Lasker versus Capablanca from St. Petersburg, 1914. If you have not yet seen that game, you should review that game. Perhaps we will make sure that we have a video on that game where it exemplifies a knight outposted with the help of a pawn, anchored on the sixth rank, can be worth as much as a rook. And in that game, Capablanca got a very valuable lesson because he did not sacrifice the exchange to capture that knight. So in this particular position, with the knight reaching d5, Gukesh immediately lops it off. And after c takes d5, Magnus may be able to take some pride in having undoubled his c-pawns. And he has a nice space advantage in the center. He's got a very pleasant position. Now, it's hard to explain Gukesh's choice here because, as I said before, we should be aware of king safety. We should be improving our worst placed pieces. And in this particular case, with the center being fixed, it is no longer necessary to castle, as this pawn structure in the center is totally immobile. King to e7, connecting the rooks, so that we might either play on the queen side or we might either play on the queen side, on the king side. So Gukesh misses this and moves the same piece twice in the opening. Notice that he hasn't found a plan for his rooks yet. The stronger player will find the right idea for the rooks, the placement of the rooks, faster and more efficiently than the opponent usually. There's been a lot to be said for the first player to score a goal in a sports game. And it also says something to be the first person to finish the opening, connect the rooks, and begin and initiate the middle game. So it's at this moment that, of course, Magnus guards his bishop pair, and Gukesh chooses a rather curious move, king f8. Instead of king e7, which would obviously be best, he chooses to migrate his king toward the g7 square, which does turn out to be just as good in the game. Magnus takes a moment here to restrict the knight on h5 from returning to the f4 square, where it could easily have been kicked away later. The best move in the position is easily, once again, being aware of king safety, castling queenside, uniting the two rooks so that they might be able to come to the center, or this rook might be able to go to that side of the board, and perhaps everything can be in gear. Everything can be coordinated and motivated. However, and I guarantee you that had he castled queenside, it would have been a clear advantage. Nevertheless, he remains with a clear advantage in this particular position. Really, he has got much more than a pawn's worth of problems besetting black. Gukesh, of course, follows through with king to g7, bishop to e3. Now, of course, it looks as though h4 is now being prepared, right? Doesn't it look as though h4 is now being prepared? So Gukesh takes just a moment to prevent this. And now Magnus makes what I feel is one of the strangest moves of the game. One of the strangest moves of the game, and this shows how off form he is. He somewhat gives up on the h4 push, or perhaps he is preparing the h4 push against any captures. But honestly, I have to give this one the full dubious mark, because in a sense, this particular moment in time, right? This particular moment in time, he needed a better square for that rook, or he simply needed to castle queenside and begin the game later. His clear advantage isn't going anywhere. He's got the better structure, he's got the space advantage, he has the two bishops. All he really needs to do is be aware of king safety, and had he castled queenside in this particular position, I can't say that it's the best move based on what Bruce says, our vegetarian killer whale from Finding Nemo, aka Stockfish, but honestly, he was perhaps worried about the move b4. And this is nothing to worry about, as black has no pieces that can actually reach the king side of the board. Instead, with the move rook to g1, Gukesh, of course, consolidates. He doesn't try to tip his hand with the best computer move b4. He consolidates his worst placed piece, preserving the placement of his rooks. And of course, in this particular position, Magnus Carlsen should indeed continue with h4. This is what he was planning. This is what he was preparing. The next best move of equal strength is castling queenside. Once again, following our conditions, our rules, our principles, our guidelines for playing the opening to the best of our ability, taking care of king safety, which will ultimately bite him in the end. Instead, Garry Kasparov on the Superbet broadcast on YouTube arrives on the scene to do some commentary, and immediately after this, when he sees Magnus Carlsen play the move b4, he questions it entirely. He's like, what kind of a move is this? Magnus Carlsen is playing to win the position. He is playing for revenge. This is not the right way to treat a chess game. You cannot play with emotion. You must play the best possible chess. And as it turns out, he is justified in his statement as the knight reaches the 5th rank, albeit on the side of the board on a4. This knight makes a little bit of a triumphant impression on the game as it is controlling the c3 square. Yes, that is right. It is controlling the c3 square. Notice there is no way that we can ever place a queen on that square. Magnus should perhaps lock up the queen side in this particular instance, and then immediately prepare for the move h4 once again. So by locking up the queen side with g4, he fixes the g5 pawn as a weakness, and he should continue on his way. After all, he still has a slide advantage. There is absolutely nothing wrong with his position, as he has a slide advantage. Now, this is a great accomplishment for Gukesh because it used to be a clear advantage for white. However, in this very moment, Magnus decides to target the weakness on b5 without, of course, considering anything of his king's safety. King f2 would have been my preference, perhaps. But in this particular instance, Gukesh immediately sets about playing a move that Magnus Carlsen did not expect, c6. While the best computer move is c5, Gukesh tackles the problem of the undefended d5 pawn, or the less defended d5 pawn. Remember, in the previous moment, the queen used to be defending the d5 pawn just a moment before. And now, by removing that defender, he is now effectively mobilizing his central pawns, which will play a role in the game shortly. As it turns out, d5 is played, and after c takes d5, knight takes d5. You can already see that not only is the knight going to d5, but it is making possible progress and inroads into this position for the c3 square. And the other knight, should it return to b6, as it does shortly, will, and perhaps might, reach the square c4. So, in this moment, Magnus Carlsen realizes, perhaps, I would at least hope that he realizes, that the position is fully equal. There is no advantage for him. The b4 pawn is targeted by a black queen and a black knight, and it has to be defended. Now, there are only a few ways to defend it. The most important way, honestly, is with the help of a counterattack. Personally, I feel like he has to start pushing his advantage with rook to c1, but he chooses the rather lackluster move a3. And after rook on h to d8, remember my comment earlier about the stronger player getting the rook to the right and more efficient squares? Rook on f to d8. Once again, Magnus Carlsen no longer is playing for his plan, which is why he put his rook on g1 in the first place. No longer playing for his plan of h4, which seems to be a colossal waste of time for the placement of those pieces on the queen side. g3, rook to g1, queen to d2 with the idea of bishop to e3. The whole king side is rather safe for black. In fact, black has the safer king. Instead, Magnus Carlsen activates the rook on the queen side, and this is not quite nearly as effective, as Gukesh follows up on his plan with rook to d6, encouraging that pawn to travel forward. Now, it's right at this moment that I believe that Magnus Carlsen realizes black's plan. And the black's plan, of course, is that if we do move our king out of danger, then rook on a to d8 presents possibilities of playing knight takes e3 and rook takes d3. And of course, there is a full-blown pin in progress because the move c7 is no longer in question because the knight is going to lop it off. However, the move bishop to b5 would have saved everything, as any movement by the knight on d5 would allow white to just move his queen, and white would have a nice clear advantage. This is probably the move that he overlooked, but in his zeal, in his emotional state, Magnus Carlsen plays the move knight bishop takes b5 immediately, and the knight on a4 plays its role with the discovery on the queen, an anchored knight on the c3 square, a double attack on the queen combined with the bishop on b5. And here Magnus Carlsen, I think, put all of his eggs in the bishop c5 basket. Now, of course, this position is, of course, equal, despite what is going on. Now, Rook takes d2. Could have easily been played, but Magnus Carlsen perhaps did not like the looks of what is happening here. Bishop takes d6, knight takes d6, and white has now given up 2 pieces for a rook on a8, and in fact black's rook on h8. He gave up 2 pieces for black's rook that traveled from h8, and you can already see the impression that it's made. While this position is still totally equal, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. However, Magnus chooses this moment to try to preserve the safety of his king. Gukesh reroutes his knight once again, the worst placed piece on the board, with, mind you, a discovered attack on the a3 pawn. So king f2, knight to b6 with a discovered attack on the a3 pawn. Queen to d3 attempts to limit the movement of black's knight to f5. However, he did not really give this enough consideration, as Gukesh simply threatens not just to protect the f5 square, but also to enter on the a2 square if needed, and the a3 pawn is now possibly in the lurch. Now, the next move by Magnus Carlsen is an example of his being out of form, as he allows the breakthrough with e4. Remember that mobile pawn center that we commented on? And after the move queen to d4, king to h8, f6 was also king to g8, king h7 was suggested by Kasparov, but he immediately corrected it to king g8. f6 would have possibly been the best move in the position. However, king safety is paramount. Magnus Carlsen does not find the right square for his rook once again. The correct square was to pin the pawn on e4 with rook to e1, foregoing any hope of saving that pawn on a3. So, with the move rook to d1, Gukesh begins to open up lines towards white's very precious king, and here Magnus Carlsen does not find the best move to prevent the incursion of the queen on h3, rook to c2, as announced by Kasparov in the online game commentary during the broadcast. Instead, I believe that he is more concerned about the queen flying in to a2, which can easily be met by rook to d2, but he did not account for queen to h3. Sometimes when you're playing with emotion, unfortunately, you will not be able to contain yourself. And at this moment in time, after queen to h3, the invasion of the queen is imminent. Magnus Carlsen flails just a little bit with king takes f3. And after the, there are so many moves here that are good for black. A rook takes a3 check begins quite the checkmating assault on the king. But Gukesh is his own person, and he simply brings his worst placed knight toward the king, creating more problems for black. The threat of rook takes a3 check is not going away, and it's at this moment that Magnus Carlsen realizes that the ship is sinking. He tries to prevent any bothers to his king on the a file with the move rook a5. Now, as Kasparov also announced, rook to e8 prepares the checkmating assault once again. Black is threatening queen to f5 check, rook to e2 check, and then queen to f3, and the game is over for the most part. There's just no stopping this. It is disaster in the making. However, as it turns out, Gukesh takes this rook, and once again, I mean, obviously if you can't recapture, you know you're already in trouble. Once again, rook to e8 sets up the same checkmating assault. However, Gukesh tries a very natural queen and knight coordinated effort toward the white king. King to g2, queen to c2 check, king to g1, and already life is getting a little bit tougher as we hit the queen, The queen moves forward to try to escort the pawn. Magnus threatens checkmate on the g2 square with the help of his queen. And it's hard to believe the pressure that Magnus Carlsen is facing in this particular position. It is very, very overwhelming. Honestly, I don't know that any normal human would be able to withstand this, but he chooses to defend his second rank. Gukesh finds the best move, and after king f2, yet another best move. The knight is adverse to being captured by the queen because the rook on d2 is hanging. The king returns to this side of the board. Now there are several moves, including queen to c4 check, that can just off the mighty Magnus. But Gukesh returns to his systematic piece coordination, returning his knight toward the center, coordinating his pieces effectively, either going to c4 or to capture the pawn on c6. After all, queen to c4 check is not going away. Even if white had chosen to play a move such as queen to d4, the knight is immune from capture because of the threat of rook to e8. And we have a very dastardly pin because the queen cannot move away because the file is dominated. There is no counterattacking move, unfortunately. So as it turns out, Magnus Carlsen, very low on time at this moment, 17 seconds on the clock after he made this move, plays queen to e7, and after the simple knight takes c6, Magnus Carlsen chooses to try to attack the rook on a8 through the knight on c6, and Gukesh forces the end of the game with rook takes e5 and the returning threat of rook to e5, pinning the queen to the king. If Gukesh had even considered Magnus's possibilities, the move rook to c2 is easily met by knight to d4 check, forking the king and the rook. And the threat of rook to e5 is almost unstoppable without the idea of playing rook to c2. Hopefully you enjoyed this greatest of all time encounter between the 18th world champion at the age of 18. He has won 5 games in a row in the Romania's Superbet Grand Chess Tour Rapid and Blitz Extravaganza. It is a star-studded field featuring the 9 top players in the world and the local wild card, Ivan Saric. Ivan Saric is the oldest player in the field, but being the wild card, crazy, right? Magnus Carlsen is the oldest player in the field of the top 9 players in the world, and it is starting to show. Welcome to my world, Magnus Owen Carlsen. Married, retired, old, too slow, unfortunately. Thank you all for being here. It has been a pleasure. Please follow or subscribe on YouTube. You don't have to hit the notification bell if you like this video. Cheers and ciao, everyone.